I'm really struggling, Stephen. I can't deny I'm really struggling with this one. I just don't understand.
Just as I was listening to that, I was thinking, well, should we put the sensible hat on first and say, well, actually, look, the cost of doing this is probably prohibitive. It's probably going to cost something like £10 billion a year every year. And while David Willetts talks about being able to fund this through changes to the inheritance tax system, I would be slightly sceptical of that. And then in this climate, it would be a very brave chancellor who decides to give very wealthy people £10,000 rather than spending it on the NHS or social care or whatever. But let's say this: I think there's a principle here which goes to your question about whether you means test it or not, and the principle I think is spot on. And the one thing that differentiates those born into wealthy families to the rest of us, if you like, is not simply income, but it's capital, and it's that capital that allows you to do things like buy a home or whatever it might be. And if you remember, it was something that Gordon Brown tried to tackle 20 years ago with the Child Trust Fund.
Well, in fact, one of my colleagues, there's only one of the right age, but I was speaking to him earlier. He is a proud recipient of, I think, 1,500 quid, something like that.
And the principle of that was that rather than child benefit, which is an income-based payment, you would build up a capital pot so that at 18 you'd have this pot to enable you to do things, whether it's education or travel or buy a home. Now, that was scrapped, of course, in George Osborne's first austerity budget because it cost £520 million at that point. This initiative of David Willetts would cost more like £10 billion. So it's difficult to justify, but the principle is there, I think, that transfers this from an income issue to a capital one.
Stephen Barber, I'm indebted to you for playing along, and I think showing how inaffordable this idea is, which I think we have to bear in mind, and also there are injustices built in it that giving the rich or those that are already rich more money. I'm uncomfortable with. Stephen Barber, thank you.
I work my butt off, to be honest. I work 5 days a week at one job and 3 days a week at another job. So I work on hours under the sun. So for me, if I had 10 grand, I would use that to pay off any loans, debts, anything like that to help me get more money to be able to support my family. With the cost of living crisis, if for someone like me and younger people who are in a low-skilled job, it would give them more money to be able to help pay with this cost of living crisis. The initial capital, people just get themselves into extreme debt just to survive. So to be able to ease that situation, to give people back more money, would be great benefit.
Do you I mean, there are always bad apples. Do you think most millennials would use the money responsibly? Do you also think that very wealthy millennials should also get 10 grand?
Okay. No, to both those questions.
Okay.
Right. Because, one, I already spoken to the lady before and already said that there needs to be a control on this £10,000. I believe that it should be spent either to pay off debts, to start a business.
Limit what you can spend the money on. Limit what you can spend the money on.
Exactly.
Yep.
Limit the money you can spend it on, because you can just, if you give £10,000 to a gambling addict, they're going to blow that. So that's not going to help them at all.
Okay. And can I ask, do you feel that your generation is having it more unfair than my generation?
I think each generation has its ups and downs.
Okay.
For someone like me, you can say it's old versus new, but to be honest, I have no hope of getting a property, right, because I'm just trying to survive, pay my bills. So the older generation having their own property, I could say I can see both sides of that. If I was being as productive as I was now in my youth, maybe I can afford the deposit to have a mortgage to be able to do that. Unfortunately for myself, bad decisions made. I wasn't as productive as I am now. I'm learning from mistakes.
Youthful mistakes. That's what youth is about, to make mistakes.
Exactly. But That's why giving the £10,000 to people needs to be controlled so they don't make a mistake with the money.
I'm just wondering, these 30-year-olds, does that include anyone who gets off an illegal boat?
Well, they wouldn't be citizens, so no.
It wouldn't?
Not if they're citizens. It's only citizens, UK citizens.
Only citizens, oh, okay. All right, the second point is I hope there's enough housing stock for these people to be able to buy it. Because if there's no housing stock, all that you're doing is the house seller will say, I want 10 grand more.
That is a killer point, Mark, a killer point.
I'm glad you like it. I said exactly the same to one of the ladies yesterday who poo-pooed the idea and said I was stupid.
No, if you know that every younger person has got 10 grand sitting in their bank account,
you can push your price up.
You can push the price up because there is a lack of housing stock. Mark,
I think it's end of conversation, isn't it?
It is kind of it. Do you just before I let you, can I ask how old you are?
I'm 60.
60, so we have a similar age.
I have 2 children. One is buying a house, one is having to rent. So I don't have any axes to grind.
Do you perceive this younger generation, the millennials, as having it unfair? I mean, my parents grew up in the aftermath of World War II, as your parents would have done. I wouldn't say they had a particularly fair life. You just got on and dealt with it. The notion that life is unfair, more unfair for one generation than another, do you buy that?
I think when I was a youngster getting married, I couldn't afford a house until I got married at the age of 27 because we needed the income of 2 people, yes, and we needed the lifetime savings of 2 people to buy a 1-bedroom flat. And then, so I think every generation has it hard, and I think every generation finds it difficult to understand that other people from a previous generation had it hard.
Agree.
Could I say one brief thing?
Go on.
When my parents got married in the mid-50s, their first house was the upper room of an uncle's house where they had no running water. They had to go downstairs, get the water, take it upstairs, boil it up from the ascot. There was no plumbing up there, so then when they cleaned it, when they'd washed up or whatever, they then had to take the water downstairs and pour it out the sink. And they lived in that house, in that upstairs flat for about 3 years, and where my elder brother was born. Now, my father was an educated man. My mother went to private and grammar school, and they could say they had it rather tough.
Yeah.
They certainly had it tougher than I did, and they certainly had it tougher than my daughters do.